Good evening and welcome to the Pandemic Podcast with me, Astin-Gregory. Tonight we're talking about the Pandemic Treaty and the legitimisation of mandates on the back of the gathering of world nations this week to discuss the possibility of a new international pandemic preparedness treaty in conjunction with the WHO, which threatens the possibility to not only legitimise but legalise many of the draconian and authoritarian restrictions and mandates that we've witnessed over the last 18 months, 20 months in response to COVID-19. This is hot off the back of the news, the breaking news today that Germany are going to exclude the unvaccinated from non-essential life, non-essential stores, cultural and recreational venues, essentially locking down the unvaccinated in Germany. Which to me, whilst it may be controversial to say, seems like the beginning steps of reenacting history, whereby a singular group, a minority group, are discriminated against under the guise of safety. This is literally like history repeating itself. Whilst it may be controversial to say such things, we could only really describe this as medical fascism. And certainly as a form of tyranny. And if you can't go that far, then you certainly can at least describe this as preposterous and egregious discrimination. And people do need to start waking up. We've lost all sense of reality. Someone's vaccination status doesn't determine their infection status. And in fact, if you're vaccinated and you've got this illusion of protection, you're actually more likely to go and spread the virus. So it's like we've talked about before in the Pandemic Podcast, authoritarianism will ultimately become self-defeating. It will defeat itself by its own ridiculousness. And this is one step further into that breach. But many people will suffer as a result of this. But I was looking at the data worldwide, and there was 3.5 billion people around the world who are not vaccinated. No, not a single dose. That's 3.5 billion people, 45% of the global population. Now, some of those may well be, of course, in developing countries where supplies have not been readily available. There's quite clearly many parts of the world that haven't had supplies. But interestingly enough, off the back of the hysteria around the South Africa, the variant discovered in South Africa, we can't call it the South African variant, and indeed it would be incorrect to call it the South African variant because A, we've already had a South African variant, and B, it was originally discovered in the Netherlands. And of course, this new Omicron variant has primarily been identified initially in vaccinated people who had been traveling using the vaccine passports. So great job at legitimizing those two tools. Anyway, that's me going into the corner of deep skeptic corner over there, but where I continue to spend most of my time at this moment in time, which is closely linked to common sense corner. So I state what is happening in Germany, A, because it's breaking and devastating to hear, but also to recognize that the central authorities of the world, namely the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Union, and the various central institutions and bodies, including the world's NGOs and charities and human rights organizations, are devastatingly silent and therefore complicit in these crimes against humanity. And I've gone from over a year ago starting this podcast, trying to present a balanced and credible overview of the various viewpoints on what is occurring around the pandemic response, to now being forced into a corner to simply call out the heinous nature of the things that are occurring right now around the world. How any members of the population can sit and watch these types of discriminatory policies. These are totally irrational and completely refutable policies on the basis of the evidence. It's an ideological warfare, not only on the unvaccinated, but on Western culture, Western democracy, Western human rights. And as we know in the UK, you went from having 80% of the population roughly fully vaccinated to 23% overnight based upon a new criteria. So this is all this is unfolding around the world. And of course, Germany is not the first nation to threaten this type of restriction. Austria have done so previously. And both nations have also threatened compulsory vaccination at a population-wide level, societal level. And again, it's unbelievable, given international law in terms of human rights law around informed consent, how any central body worth their salt is enabling this to happen. So we can deduce that organizations like the United Nations, World Health Organization, European Union are well and truly part of the private-public global partnership that is driving this hideous drive into medical tyranny. But I wanted to say this at the beginning to set the context for tonight's episode, on the basis that this week, for Monday, world nations gathered to discuss the possibility of an international pandemic treaty, setting out how to deal with the next crisis, on the basis that experts, let me just do my quote unquote, experts believe it's only a matter of time before the next pandemic emerges. Well, given the demand it creates for pharmaceutical products and other associated high profit items, well, you've developed an incredible business model. Why wouldn't you want another pandemic to arise in order to, another falsely inflated state of emergency to drive the world into hysteria, further into alarmism, so that you can fill your greedy boots with the latest opportunities that this future crisis could provide? Again, just deeply from skeptical corner there. Apologies if you're a new viewer thinking, I heard this guy was a very reasonable, balanced individual. I do consider myself to be both reasonable and balanced and rational. In fact, many of the people who are coming up with these ridiculous mandates, I would historically even possibly believe were rational, but clearly people have lost their minds, and hopefully we're going to have a number of different psychologists coming on the show to examine why we have such ludicrous behaviors amongst world leaders, following the success of the interview of Professor Matthias Desmet on the show, which has now had over 1 million views. So this gathering is to set out how to better prepare for the next pandemic, on the basis that experts believe there's another one during the matter of time. Now, let's be straight. Let's go into common sense corner, outside of all the outside of all the craziness, and talk about pandemics in general. Let's have an honest conversation about pandemics. Clearly, where there is a health threat to a portion of society or society as a whole, the world would benefit from a reasonable plan to tackle that threat, such as the type of plans that we previously saw, which didn't require mass lockdowns, mass vaccinations, vaccine passports, all enabled by this global public-private partnerships, and the emergence of new technologies, again, profit lines, that can be bolstered into this type of pandemic response. So clearly, we do need some sort of prepared plan. What we've witnessed over the last 18, 20 months is chaos. It's absolute chaos. And that's just not adequate. So yes, there does need to be some form of plan, of course, some sort of preparedness plan. But that preparedness plan should not be about, which on the surface of things, of course, the World Health Organization and the organizations who are putting together this plan aren't mapping it out as a profit plan publicly, but quite clearly there are private interests that are intrinsically involved in this planning process that stand to gain absolute fortunes from every single pandemic that exists. So yes, I do agree that preparedness is required, and I also agree that nations need to collaborate on sharing data and all that kind of stuff. But we also need to see that any preparedness plan is not myopically focused, in the case of a respiratory pandemic, on just cases of a virus with a tenuously diagnosed case description, which has created this ginormous bubble of fear and every resultant problem since. Now, you could argue that was part of the pandemic preparedness plan. The people involved in creating the testing protocols and the mass vaccination programs, all these things are intrinsically linked to this centralization of power. Now, the only piece of good news, I'm going to talk about the backdrop to the legal backdrop to what's occurred in the last 2 years very briefly in a minute, because the Pandemic Preparedness Treaty, I believe, is going to come in either in conjunction or in replacement of the 2005 International Health Regulations, which I'll talk about in a minute, because these already exist, which in some way legalize and legitimize some of the things we've seen in the last 2 years. But the biggest risk that this particular treaty creates is two things. Number one, the legitimization and even the legalization of the types of responses that we've witnessed in the last 20 months. And by the way, this has been created in the midst of this crisis, whereby the cost of these actions are still being tallied, namely the distinct impact, for instance, on the over 1 billion days of collective education lost around the world and the consequent impact on the children's lives as they grow forward. We've already seen through previous analysis that those who suffer extended periods of education loss go on to have lower earnings, lesser career prospects, even limited physical and social development. We do not know the extent, just in the education sector alone. We've seen record hospital waiting lists in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure the same is true in other parts of the world, many parts of the world. We've seen record national debts. We've seen the world's plunged into recession, these inflationary pressures, which we're only starting to make sense of now. We've seen huge social divides, civil unrest. We've seen a mental health crisis beyond all mental health crisis. We're seeing the dramatic costs of these draconian policies, which, going back to point one about Germany going into some form of lockdown, we're just not learning from our mistakes. We're just not even paying attention. That we're not looking at costs and benefits. Society isn't, the intelligent folk amongst society aren't spending time to say, well, hang on a minute, we've just had multiple lockdowns. A, they didn't curb the impact of the virus. B, they didn't reduce the overall volume of mortality comparatively to other countries that had lighter touch approaches. And C, we've got this trail of destruction that the incumbent politicians won't have to deal with in the next 4 years because they will no longer be in power. But we're just not learning. And here we are potentially within this international treaty, baking in these types of responses for the future inevitable pandemic, according to the experts. Whose experts are we talking to here? Interestingly enough, Sunetra Gupta, who was one of the authors of the herd immunity program, the Great Barrington Declaration, which I personally believe if the world had followed, we would have gone past this pandemic. We'd be back to life as we know it, without all of these hysteria, lockdowns, and vaccine passports, vaccine mandates, the erosion of the social fabric. But no, those, if we were to pass without, again, going in, this is more into skeptic / conspiracy corner / definitely skeptic, not conspiracy. These conditions create the necessary frameworks for societal shifts, for economic shifts. This great narrative that the World Economic Forum are producing in plain sight, even calling it the Great Narrative, not even trying to dress it up as something else like the Great Reset. Economic shifts that will result in the next couple of years, which are directly attributable to this particular situation, will be profound. Nonetheless, we stand at the precipice of these things being legalized and legitimized, despite the very chaos that these things have caused and the great harms that have been caused. And again, case in point, this is a possible bannable piece of content I'm about to say. It's not necessarily for these types of platforms, but I saw a chart today which overlaid the vaccine rollout and the COVID mortality on one side, which paid no attention to the overall impact on overall mortality. So one of the statisticians had gone on and overlaid the all-cause mortality over the same chart, and you saw, again, a distinct correlation between the volume of vaccine rollouts and all-cause mortality. What I would call that, for my financial background, I'm not an accountant, but I have financial qualifications, and I worked in financial services for 8 years. I would call that creative accounting, which is taking deaths from one column, putting them in another to make it look like that particular thing over here, this thing is no longer an issue. That to me, a creative accounting is another way to describe fraud. But most people just haven't got the wherewithal to go beyond the headline numbers and start to tinker beneath the surface and see what's going on beneath the tip of the iceberg. Nonetheless, I'm really deeply in skeptic corner tonight, and I know that when I get too deep in skeptic corner, I switch some people off because it's just too much. But we've got to call a spade a spade. Anyway, 2005 international health regulations. Let's briefly talk about this. Let's briefly talk about the international health regulations, because these are important on the basis that this is the existing legal frameworks that exist on a global level that underpin the current health situation that we're facing. And this set of frameworks actually provide the state with the legal right to inspect your travel history in affected areas affected by the pandemic. They legalize the opportunity for the state to require proof of medical examination, lab analysis, and testing. They legalize the right of the state to demand proof of vaccination. They legalize the right to place suspect persons into public health observation and isolation, i.e. quarantine. They legitimize and legalize the implementation of tracing of contacts, and they give governments and their agencies and private sector the rights to refuse entry of suspect affected persons. Therefore, under these international health regulations of 2005, all of the measures, including the prospect of widespread vaccine mandates, are technically legal under this former treaty. By the way, suspect persons. Can you really imagine that term? I mean, it just gives rise to almost any possible action against any possible individual where no person is spared. But just to get clear that these regulations are already in place, but the Pandemic Treaty seeks to further expand the powers of the World Health Organization and put further power in this central organization. Now, one of the things we must, and what that does therefore, is give the World Health Organization, bearing in mind their number one funder is Bill Gates, who's intrinsically linked financially with almost every aspect of the pandemic response, from vaccines themselves to the supply chains to digital IDs, vaccine passports. I mean, this is, Gates himself, without going into conspiracy corner, just going to say, because, and I make jokes about this because it's about, the Pandemic podcast is about speaking about what is observable and what is verifiable. What is verifiable is that Bill Gates is invested in almost every dynamic of the pandemic response. Now, he came up with this genius idea several years ago where he would call what's occurring now creative capitalism. Interesting, sounds like creative accounting that I talked about a minute ago. One of his favorite books, by the way, is How to Lie with Statistics. Yeah, imagine that. I mean, if you've been paying attention to the Pandemic podcast for the last 12, 18 months, we focused on many of the lies within statistics over and over again. In fact, I look forward to having Norman Fenton back on the show to look at some more of the lies within the vaccination rollout data. I mean, if you haven't already checked in on some of the stuff that's coming out as a result of the Pfizer Freedom of Information requests, there were some documents shared yesterday. Mind-blowing. This should have the public and the media in hysteria. Just these single documents. It's crazy. It's negligence. It's fraud. It's misrepresentation. It's a whole series of crimes. but Bill Gates is invested at almost every level of the pandemic response, and he described creative capitalism as a mode of creating capitalism for social good. Now, of course, we've seen the idea of the social good, the common good, used as a wrapper throughout this last 18 months, 20 months. And it quite clearly is this film that covers people's eyes, that doing things for the greater good therefore legitimizes anything that follows the notion that one is acting to protect others or to protect society or to protect the healthcare system. It just washes over people's minds, and it leads them to believe that anything that they are told, as long as it's for the greater good, is for the greater good. And it seems that being perceived as righteous via virtue signaling is I'm going on a sidetrack here, cultural sidetrack. Being virtuous and seen to be right is more important than being right. It's just a ludicrous post-truth situation that we're living ourselves in. But I tell this story because Bill Gates is the number one funder of the World Health Organization. It's almost undoubtable that the World Health Organization will further bolster its powers through public-private partnerships. And if you want to understand the kind of yarn ball that underpins what we're experiencing right now, you do need to start to understand the public-private complex, the relationship between private individuals, private companies, corporations, and the state and central bodies, because this is something that's been really driven since the 1960s, 1970s, and predominantly the 1970s, but in recent decades, these major corporations have seriously infiltrated central organizations and lined the wheels of the types of activity or greased the wheels of the types of activity that we're seeing now. So the idea of the World Health Organization having its power bolstered by a pandemic treaty not only threatens the legitimization and legalization of the types of activities that we've witnessed, these draconian policies and the devastating consequences that we've witnessed in the last 20 months, but further offers the opportunity for private interest to further infiltrate public health policy. And I, for one, do not stand for that level of involvement. It's completely flawed. But this is a reflection at every level. This is something that is rife at every level within central institutions, from the United Nations, which essentially is next on the list of the kind of public-private. It's already going down that road. It's the kind of corporate takeover, if you will, the technocratic authoritarian takeover, which we're just witnessing. It's the stuff that's below the surface. The mandates, the policies we see, they're the tip of the iceberg that you can see above the ocean. It's the ginormous things underneath the ocean that are simply, whilst in plain sight, are often the things that people aren't aware of, because it's not the thing you read about in the news. It's not the thing you see on the 6 o'clock TV show. It's not the sort of things you talk about with your friends. But the reality is, this pandemic has showed that the boiling frog that has been bubbling away for years and years, decades upon decades, has now reached boiling point. And all of these things are coming to the surface. The steam is rising, and we're starting to see everything for what it is. And as I've spoken about in previous podcasts, despite the negative tone of this episode pointing out the problem, well, where would we get if we merely pointed out the problems? I personally believe that this is the most exciting time in recent history, because every one of these central organizations, from government level to the United Nations to the World Health Organization, have essentially kind of revealed the kind of that the emperor is naked. The emperor is wearing no clothes, and these organizations are no longer fit for purpose to represent the interests of the people on the planet. The United Nations itself was formed after a prior crisis, after World War II. So here we are at the precipice of the final stages of this. I do believe of the final stages of this particular pandemic. Although every time it's almost gone, and people have gone on with their lives, it's like let's throw a scariant in there. Let's throw another fear. Let's throw something else at them so that they don't get on with their lives. That we just imagine having our lives back and just living freely. We can't allow that. let's chuck another scariant in there. Let's give it a fancy name, a moronic here as an anagram, for instance, to continue the state of emergency. But I've gone off on a complete tangent. The real point here is this: that the bolstering of the WHO through the likes of the Pandemic Treaty is a real risk. But to my point about opportunity, beyond what we're experiencing right now, I believe is the greatest opportunity to create new institutions, new organizations, new systems and structures that better serve the interests of the people and the planet that we live upon. Because the missing component of the public-private partnership is the public. You should call it the state-private partnership, because it's nothing to do with the public. The state is supposed to represent the public and the interests of the public, but there is clearly a ginormous disconnect between the state and the people. This paternalistic relationship that's been created, with the state being the kind of draconian, authoritarian parent of the naughty, irresponsible child that needs punishing and being sent to their room, has created this fascinating wedge between an even further wedge between the people and the state, further growing the distrust amongst the people in the state. But recognizing that this is again this is the culmination of decades of slide, because the public right now, if you look at the political party memberships in the UK, it's less than 1% of the UK population is a member of a political party. That is a dramatic shift. Historically, the public would be part of political parties. They'd find other ways to have their influence and say in the political process, and become engaged at the party level in determining policy. But no, we are disenfranchised. We are disengaged, and the relationship between the public and the state is fractured. So as a result, this idea of a public-private partnership, it's not about the public. It's about the state, and it's about the interests of the corporate elites. Quite simply. Which I find just fascinating to see. But as a result, there are these huge opportunities. So in short, the prospect for the Pandemic Treaty not only legitimizes and legalizes what we've seen over the last 20 months, but threatens to place further power into the hands of these central organizations. One of the biggest factors that, if you look at the factors that underpin, if you try to rationalize how this is happening, because to the rational mind, none of this makes sense. To the conscious, awakened, rational mind, none of this makes sense. But many people aren't operating out of a conscious, awakened, rational mind, because when fear is so pervasive, it takes you out of conscious awareness and into that fear zone where paranoia sets in, and all manner of chemical imbalances that lead you into take you away from that conscious, awakened, rational thought. People are behaving irrationally. They're thinking, feeling, and behaving irrationally during this pandemic. And fear is one of the primary determinants of that, as created by the perpetual state of emergency. So bolstering the powers of these central organizations is actually at the very core, the very heart of what is happening here, and in itself is a major problem. But again, the good news is, beneath the surface, in a different way, there is a gigantic pull towards push and pull towards decentralization of everything. Decentralization of finance, decentralization of state, decentralization of healthcare, decentralization of education. This government overreach and the centralization of money, power, and control is leading to new systems and structures being built. That is the great opportunity. However, the risk at this stage of this pandemic treaty is that it gives the power to the WHO to simply declare a state of emergency on demand, which in the terms of the treaty could be applied to any deemed hazard, not just pandemics, which means that you can declare a public health emergency of pandemic proportional potential. That gives undue power further undue power to this central organization, and as a result, plays into this centrist, this centralized power, and this trend towards alarmism, whether it's pandemic alarmism or climate alarmism, which is all is used, as we can see, to grease the wheels of profit. That's ultimately what's happening here. The flow of money and power continues to go in one direction. Now, I consider myself to be historically politically central. And what frightens me the most is that many of the topics I've covered in this particular episode are historically battlegrounds of the left side of politics. It's standing against this centralization of money and power to the global elites, at least on the corporate side. Yet it's just been this mist, this fog has covered people's eyes, and the belief that this is all in the interest of the common good for society, for one another, whereas actually it's corporate greed dressed up as common good. Just do any of the reading around this idea of conscious capitalism or creative capitalism. It's in fact, they don't call it conscious capitalism. That's what I would call genuine conscious capitalism that seeks to actually make a difference. But this is something that the battleground of the left is left behind, and the right side of politics normally argues against the size and scope of the state. And here we have the right of politics only in minority proportion standing against government overreach. So we've got this peculiar situation where on one side of politics normally stand up against the profiteering and the greed and the power mongering of the global elite are absent, and on the other side, the side of politics that would stand up against egregious government overreach and centralization of power are also woefully missing. So we've got these wonderful conditions for these types of things to just ride on and keep going. It's insane. So the good news is, for the conscious and the awake amongst us that can make sense of the world from a place of conscious awareness and rational thought, can take stock and recognize, A, we have an opportunity to resist what is happening, firstly, and secondly, and more importantly, to recognize the opportunity to think towards the future and start building the future today. Because believe me, this whole thing is going to fall apart. Rest assured, it will. I mentioned during this broadcast that 3.5 billion people around the world haven't had a single vaccine. Again, some of those are, of course, due to lack of supply, but millions upon millions of them are due to lack of are because of choice. Even the most vaccinated nations around the world, talking of Germany as a case study within this, I think it's 70%, 75% fully vaccinated according to the previous definition of 2 jabs. Well, that means that 25% of the population, on average, within the most vaccinated countries, 20 to 25% of the population are choosing not to be vaccinated. That is millions upon millions upon millions of people. So good luck with your mandates when you've got millions upon millions, even though on paper they are the minority. They are a very strong and vocal and willing minority. So good luck with your mandates. Good luck. This is the beginning. Thank you. 65% Germany, slightly below the kind of numbers that we've seen in the UK and other parts of Europe. But this is the beginning of the end. The more crazy things become, whilst it may last a while, it is the beginning of the end. And as always, authoritarianism does not prosper. It will not survive. But how long the undercurrent, this centralization of power, the cultural safetyism, this paternalistic type approach, and the various other forces that are guiding here, this is where things could play out for longer. We're seeing it at a systemic level. We're seeing it through the kind of climate alarmism. It's culturally and socially playing out in ways that we couldn't have predicted, but it's accelerated within the last 5 to 10 years. But again, rest assured, at the root of this is human behavior. The one thing I've read most about in my lifetime is human behavior and philosophy around human interaction and the human condition. And there are many authors who have written about the cyclical patterns of human beings. And the good news is we will go in another cycle, which may mean it gets worse before it gets better. But rest assured, there will be another cycle. And the work that you and I are doing, and those of us who are participating within this kind of conscious resistance and the kind of awakened activism and the conscious creation of the future, we are part of that shift. We are part of that shift. We are part of sending the pendulum back the other way. What we need to recognize, what we need to realize, is rather than going through these revolutions, these cycles, is that if we can just spiritually and consciously evolve, then we can avoid all of these continual cycles and flip-flopping between every form of existence, and actually come to this kind of more balanced equilibrium where life and people can live in harmony. But a harmonious environment is not a good condition for those who want to profit from the situation. So you have to really pay attention to the mechanics. If you're interested in reading the history of this kind of disruption of harmony of people in recent history, just look at the recent history of media and advertising, and how these tools have been used to polarize and divide society. So it's time ultimately to claim the power back. It's time to put the public back in the public sector, and it's time to for those amongst us who are conscious and awake, to start sowing the seeds of tomorrow. That is our greatest opportunity. And in order to do that, we cannot allow these types of situations to drive us into fear, to drive us into paranoia, because otherwise we just become part of the problem on the other side of the coin. It's about getting out of that matrix. It's about coming back to conscious awareness. It's about having rational, grounded approach to this, not falling down rabbit holes or the paranoid parts of this. The fear that comes from the emergence of tyranny and authoritarianism. It's about coming grounded into that conscious awareness, having faith that good will prevail. Know that our destiny is in our own hands, and we have the capability when empowered to act. So the future is in our hands. The change that we want to see is with us. And my work going forward, as much as I enjoy kind of dissecting the issues that we're witnessing around us in a reasonably balanced. I think balance has been lost. It's quite clear where my perspective lies on all of this. But at least to offer the right to reply and to entertain different viewpoints in the public forum, but more so really keen to look at awakened forms of activism, peaceful activism to actually resist, but more importantly, conscious creation of the future, conscious co-creation of the future. That's where I become most excited about how we can create a movement of conscious beings elevated to elevate humanity and enrich the world that we live upon, and start building conscious communities that can be part of that change. And that's what I'm most excited to be part of, as I truly believe that the seeds of change are in our hands and the ground is fertile, ready to be planted and for the future that we want to create for ourselves and our future and our children, our children's children. As much my inspiration comes from looking at my son and seeing the world that he's going to grow up in, as it does from the kind of pull factor of the future versus the push factor of all the draconian authoritarianism that we're witnessing now. So no matter what happens, hold out hope. Yes, things may get more difficult. For those in Germany right now, if they're not vaccinated, goodness me, the pressure is on. But of course, watch the civil unrest unravel. Germany is getting organized. As are Austria. Watch the resistance, but it's not just about resistance. It's about creation. It's about being ready for the next phase. The power to create the future is in our hands. All right. Well, I'm going to say good night for now. Thank you very much for tuning in. Back tomorrow evening with Alan Miller to talk about the Together campaign that is currently underway in the UK, specifically around vaccine passports. And I'm joined on Monday evening by a wonderful guest who's going to be talking about the NHS 100K campaign, which is about how to protect the NHS workers whose livelihoods and lives are being threatened by vaccine mandates. And more importantly, how public health will be impacted by these mandates. We've already seen 70,000 staff, up to 70,000 staff affected by the care mandates. The care sector is in dire straits. So this shows why it's important not only to create the future, but also to resist what's going on, to preserve the present moment. So I'm joined on Monday by a wonderful guest to talk about the NHS 100K campaign. You may have seen the hashtag This Hill with the various NHS workers and their placards taking a stand against medical mandates across both care and healthcare. So some interesting episodes coming up. Tune in tomorrow night with Alan Miller at 5 p.m. and you'll see again 8 p.m. on Monday night. To make sure you stay up to date with our latest content, please just take 1 minute of your time to go to danjgregory.com/pandemic to enter your name and email to join our mailing list. We've got some exciting news about a new online community that we're launching in the next few weeks. And you can also join our Telegram channel if you're not already part of our Telegram channel. Just look for Pandemic Podcast UK on Telegram. You'll see our logo. Come and join the community. And I look forward to seeing you at our very next broadcast. Good evening to you. Have a wonderful night. And I'll see you.